So I think most people have arrived now, and Jessica will let anybody else in when they arrive in the waiting room. So I'm going to hand over to Flint. Thank you.
Greetings once again, and thank you for your introduction and holding this space, Josh. Facing the screen is facing the wall, as we would in a zendo. So in our cloud zendo, the wall becomes our screen. And each of the small squares that might show up, we don't see so many of them in a webinar, we see a few. And these are the portals into the larger space of the Sangha for each of us. So let's begin as we have each day, and I hope I've finally gotten this to you, by repeating the verse before the Dharma talk, and we'll repeat it 3 times. The Dharma is vast and subtle. We now have a chance to hear it, study it, and practice it. We vow to realize its true meaning. The Dharma is vast and subtle. We now have a chance to hear it, study it, and practice it. We vow to realize its true meaning. The Dharma is vast and subtle. We now have a chance to hear it, study it, and practice it. We vow to realize its true meaning. As we continue our deep listening, our studying, and our practice, as a way of expressing our vow to realize the true meaning of the Dharma, which is vast and subtle, our theme is welcome everything, push away nothing, which is a foundational way of understanding the everyday orientation or effort of our practice in Zen. Dogen calls it effort without desire, our wholehearted participation in the ways that Frank Ostaseki's 5 precepts suggest, without a desire or at least an attachment to fruition, but a discovery, as Robert Aiken had described it, a discovery of our lives and what our lives can be and what they are, and what our relationships represent to us and how we can be of service. As we move in our practice, gently letting go of the hope of fruition of a certain outcome, a particular outcome to which we are attached or subtly, actually, even demanding inside. And we also let go of the other side, which Catherine spoke about. One side is the attachment, the other side is despair, giving up. Instead, walk straight on, as the old woman on the road to Wute spoke about, straight on into the face of uncertainty. There's a little story that many of you have heard, I believe, or have read, which opens the volume Crooked Cucumber, the biography of Shunryu Suzuki Roshi, in which the author of the biography, David Chadwick, is asking him at Tassajara many years ago, more than 50 years ago, what is the essence of Buddhism? Could he essentialize it in one word or one phrase? One of those foolish questions, but you wonder what the teacher's going to say. And that night he said, Suzuki did respond to that question. He said, everything changes. next question. And so it does. And as we move into the face of uncertainty, to me, uncertainty seems a bit conceptual. We understand it. But the embodied expression of that is actually vulnerability. That we feel the vulnerability of our lives. And if we're able to be intimate with our body, our breath, and this is what we're practicing when we sit, our own minds, our own hearts, our own projections, and receiving the sensory input from the world, from which we create what we call reality, which is actually a virtual reality, as we construct and maintain a self, this fictional, flimsy construction. As we sit, we rest back into a primary vulnerability, not just our stories of vulnerability. And I hope that some of you will watch the small interview with Frank Ostatecky where he talks about this in the interview, which I believe was sent to you in a link. If you've not watched it, since he developed the Zen Hospice project, he's worked with many, many people who have been critically ill and have died. And this past year, in 2019, he had several strokes in which he became the patient, and he speaks about vulnerability in that way. And in those moments, there's so much unknown, so much uncertainty, and it's not something we're standing back from and witnessing or thinking about. It's that primary vulnerability of standing on the edge, shaky, vulnerable, and yet fully alive. The fact is, most of us actually don't understand our lives, and that's not an indictment or a criticism. It's more like a question. What if we actually don't understand our lives? What if underneath and behind the life that we think we are living lies a bigger and wider and deeper life that we are living, but that we don't know and don't understand? This is what our practice helps us begin to settle into. And these kinds of questions are that we bring to inquiry and help us open to this inconceivable aspect of our lives are distinguished by what I would call the everyday approach. And you hear this as people come to inquiry all the time. It's natural. There's some version of the question, primary question is, how do I solve my life? How do I solve this problem, that problem? People come and say, what do I do about, and just fill in the blank. How do I solve my life? But the deeper approach, that's a worthy approach. But the deeper approach is, how do I appreciate and live this shared life? And that's our approach in practice. There may be problems to solve, but ultimately, life isn't to be solved, it's to be appreciated and lived. How do I appreciate and live this shared life rather than how do I solve my life? Because that never stops. That's an ongoing sort of coping or managing process rather than a deep resting in the mystery and the beauty of life. So practice focuses our hearts beyond our circumscribed lives that we see and turns us toward the life that we can't exactly see or understand, but one which we are already living, that's living us. Some of you might remember in the Precepts ceremony, the ceremony that celebrates some people's study of the foundational ethical framework in Zen practice, there are what are called the 3 pure precepts, and the third of which says, I vow to live and be lived for the benefit of all beings. And practice focuses our hearts in this way, beyond the circumscribed lives, in other words, the particulars that we want to try to solve. And we turn towards that life that we actually can't grasp, but the one which we are living. This is the life that maybe one of your good friends or your partner might see, that your teacher hopefully works to see, but one that you can't see. And this is the great benefit of spiritual friendship. This is actually what all those old stories illuminate. They're relationships in which the characters walk together into a world they inhabit together, but which they individually and solely can't actually see so fully. It's like Mugai Nyodai going to the old nun. She couldn't see. All she felt was a failure. But the old nun saw it differently. She could see deeper. This is what challenges like COVID-19 opens for us. We inevitably and relentlessly lose the ground that we stand on in ways that are so totalizing that there's actually no handhold, no ground, no coping strategy, and no spiritual practice that helps, that solves the problem. No amount of spiritual practice will solve this illness, but it will help us find a way to make our lives and appreciate our lives and our relationships possible, which Catherine spoke about in her own way the other day. This is the true vulnerability for which there is no rehearsal. And these old stories, and maybe even this deeper story in our own life, we're not meant to understand these stories in a conventional way. And goodness knows we try. We read some of these old Zen stories and they're frustrating or paradoxical or just strange. And we think, why can't I understand it? But this is not what they're for. We let our practices and the old stories enter all the misunderstood currents of our lives, as well as our everyday habitual perspective, so that those hidden parts of our lives will open up in a fresh and sometimes in a startling way. Instead of trying to understand, and Joanna Macy says, these are our addictions, we attempt to explain, predict, and control life rather than appreciate it. So instead of trying to understand, explain, predict, control, we marinate in or are saturated by these stories. We walk along with Mugai with her bucket. We look at the moon. We see the reflections in the water. We allow ourselves to get closer to our own brokenness and our own patching and the ongoing dance of that. We meet the old woman on the way to Mount Utai, and as we practice, we continue to hear, just go straight on, continue. No side roads, no mucking about, there's nothing special, go straight on. And sometimes we meet this true woman of the way on the road, brimming with Amitabha Buddha's infinite light. And we wonder, who is that? How is she doing that? What can she teach me? Our lives are stirred and affected by this kind of immersion, outside, completely separate from what we think about our lives, beyond conceptualization. And it's not unnecessary for us to understand all of this in order for the stories to do their work on us. Understanding, we usually think, is going to be the transformational turn. If I can just understand this, then I will be different. If I can get it, then I will transform. But actually, understanding isn't the transformational term. It's the mystery. It's immersion with and intimacy with the mystery that shows us a different face. Not the one we see on the screen that we cringe or worry about or just puzzled about. Who is that person? And the old stories have always been offered, and this is just a technical thing, as a kind of, well, there's an assumption in the old stories. When they were offered to the monks and nuns in the past, there was an assumption that those people hearing the stories were immersed in practice, that they had regular meditation, that they were working with the teacher, they lived in some sort of community, a Sangha that would support them. And this is the context in which these stories can unfold most beautifully and fully. And this whole retreat and our current situation is one of these stories opening right now. It's not some story from the past. We thought we knew what going straight on would look like this May, but it turned out to be a different path. We wonder if we'll be ill or someone we know will be ill, or if we'll have enough work or money or food or healthcare. We're not sure. And an integrated intensive like this, where we're not in a retreat center, we're not stepping away from our ordinary life, but we're immersed in life. This is the immersion, the marinating, the saturation of life. I don't know what will happen, or in some ways what the purpose is, the deeper purpose, or what any of us might get, or where this will take us. But this is what all true spiritual practice is about. Revealing ourselves to ourselves in surprising and unexpected ways, often in response to impossible questions or very challenging circumstances. And these practices ask us to practice turning toward everything and to practice not pushing things away and to see what happens when we do. I very much like this definition of compassion, which I'm going to share with you, and I'll send it on to you, by Joan Sutherland, the Zen teacher. And it's quite amazing, and so I want to unpack it a bit. Here's the quotation. I'll go over it several times so we can rest in it and let it begin to penetrate us. I wonder if many of you know the story, it comes to mind right now, about early on when Suzuki Roshi first came to the United States. He came to San Francisco, I believe in 1959, and was taking care of primarily a Japanese community, not Americans. There was no Zen center. It was a proper temple where Japanese people who lived in San Francisco would go, and he took care of that community. But later, the young people found him. In the early days, it was, remember, the beatniks, and then it was the hippies, and on, because he was this Zen master, and they wanted to learn about Zen, and one thing led to another, and a practice center in the United States was born aside from the Japanese community that he served. And he talked about walking from his residence to the temple in the early days in San Francisco. And many of you who have been there, it's like some parts of the UK as well. The mornings are often very cool and damp, and there is fog quite often. And he said even a mist, he would walk In the UK, you have so many different names for the way moisture comes through the air. He would walk, and even if it's not raining, it was just the air would be full of moisture. And he said, and he'd be wearing his robes. And he said, by the time he got there, he was wet. And he thought, wait, it didn't rain on me. How did this happen? And it was a great analog to walking through one's life. And if we let ourselves be penetrated, we find that it goes down to the bone. So here is a definition of compassion, which is, remember, the function of turning toward, meeting suffering, and not turning away. I'll read the whole thing through and then we'll go back. Joan Sutherland says, compassion isn't a commodity we deliver, but a commitment to help liberate the intimacy already inherent in any situation. She goes on, usually the most intimate response to another's difficulty begins with the willingness not to flee. Fleeing can take the form of abandoning the situation, and it can also mean escaping into helping, into a whole constellation of ideas about what ought to happen. Intimacy is being willing to stay and accompany and listen, to be vulnerable and surprised and flexible. It's the willingness to fall with someone else and see what becomes possible when we do. I was stunned when I first read that piece. And by the way, this is excerpted from an essay by Joan Sutherland in the book that I mentioned yesterday, The Hidden Lamp, Stories About Women. So let's go back to the beginning. The first sentence is stunning because it flies in the face of the way that most spiritual practices are often languaged or shaped, which, and I apologize for this sounding a bit critical in some ways. So many practices are offered to us as what I call manager practices. They're actually practices that are offered to solve something, rather than practices that plunge us into the mystery and help us open and evolve something, which is always and already there. Compassion isn't a commodity we deliver. Compassion isn't something you do to someone. I'm going to be compassionate to you. I'm going to cultivate my compassion. It's a cultivated skill rather than an innate quality that opens as I step out of the way. Compassion isn't a commodity we deliver, but a commitment, and I would add a capacity to help liberate the intimacy already inherent in any situation. So this flies in the face of so much that we believe that compassion is something we can develop and then use or give. And that what's inherent in every situation is a capacity for intimacy. That's at the heart of everything. It's another way of saying, if everything is Buddha nature, at the heart of every single thing, even our darkest moment, even our greatest contraction, when liberated, there's a jewel there, there's gold, there's Buddha. So compassion, that willingness, that commitment, that capacity isn't a thing we're going to have that we're going to utilize, but it's this firm commitment. It's a vow. It's an ongoing willingness to liberate the intimacy already inherent in any situation. It's very similar to Peter Hirschach's definition of a bodhisattva, which is the work of a bodhisattva is to help free or liberate each moment, each relationship, each situation, and turn it just a tiny bit more towards freedom. It's that same capacity. So this sentence is worth the whole day, I think, in some ways. Compassion isn't a commodity we deliver, but a commitment and a capacity to help liberate the intimacy already inherent in any situation. But that only comes if we can appreciate the situation and plunge into it. She says, usually the most intimate response to another's difficulty begins with a willingness not to flee. The most intimate response is just to stay. And then she speaks about turning away or pushing away can be, there are several ways to abandon the situation. One can be just turning away and leaving, closing down, shutting off, whatever. But the other escape is helping, to jump into action without actually meeting what's there. Because so often our action is based on our yearnings, our desires, our fears, and not what's actually happening. So we can start with the beginner's mind. Remember that last of the 5 precepts in Frank's list, beginner's mind, so that we can bear witness deeply. Then compassionate action can emerge. She says, intimacy is being willing to stay and accompany and listen, to be vulnerable, to be surprised and flexible. And then the stunning final sentence, it's a willingness to fall, and I say to fail, to fall with someone else, and to see what becomes possible when we do. This is Trudy's thank you for helping me fall or fail. That came at the end of her message to me with her poem. It's the willingness to fall with someone else. It's the last thing that we want to do. It doesn't mean collapse. It doesn't mean to be falling down to an unresourceful place. It means following and bearing witness and accompanying and walking with. It means lying down in the deathbed with and holding close. It means just bearing witness without trying to do something, and to see what becomes possible when we do. That's quite a challenge, to not think that we can become a compassionate person and give it to people, but instead to look for ways through just simple presence for freedom to be liberated in the situation, and to follow people where they are, to assist them. That's true compassion. It's one of the reasons I think in several of the poems, and certainly in the story that Trudy shared, that the moon is so important. You know, the moon isn't the source of the heat and light and energy. It's a reflection. It's a reflection from the sun. And sometimes we can see that reflection of the source brilliantly, like the last few days when it's been full, and sometimes we see it only in part. And that's the rhythm of our lives, of attempting to see more closely, more fully, yet knowing it's always there. It's never gone. The moon is completely there, but we don't often see it. And so it is with our own true nature. The other thing important about the moon, I think, is it's often thought of as kind of a feminine quality. It doesn't demand anything. It's not aggressive. And yet, just by her presence, by the moon's presence, entire oceans move. It's massively powerful just by presence. And this is possible for us. I'll leave you before we make a transition here with a poem by Hafiz, another Sufi mystic, which we sometimes go to. This poem, the English translation, is All the Hemispheres, which I quite like given the universal challenge of this program, this problem we have right now with COVID-19. It's kind of a program. It's testing us. So here's the first time through. All the hemispheres. Leave the familiar for a while. Leave the familiar for a while. Let your senses and bodies stretch out like a welcomed season onto the meadows and shores and hills. Open up to the roof. Make a new watermark on your excitement and love. Like a blooming night flower, bestow your vital fragrance of happiness and giving upon our intimate assembly. Change rooms in your mind for a day. All the hemispheres in existence lie beside an equator in your heart. Greet yourself and your 1,000 other forms as you mount the hidden tide and travel back home. All the hemispheres in heaven are sitting around a fire chatting while stitching themselves together into the great circle inside of you. Leave the familiar for a while. The invitation of our retreat, leave the familiar for a while, but embody yourself in your life in this integrated intensive. Let your senses and body stretch out like a welcome season onto the meadows and shores and hills. Open up to the roof. Make a new watermark on your excitement and love. See how it climbs. Like a blooming night flower, bestow your vital fragrance of happiness and giving upon our intimate assembly. And this is what Cesca will be doing in a moment, like a blooming night flower, bestowing this vital fragrance and giving upon our intimate assembly. Change rooms in your mind for a day. Don't get stuck. All the hemispheres in existence lie beside an equator in your heart. Remember the old woman? Where is Amitabha Buddha? Greet yourself and your 1,000 other forms. I'm not who I think I am. As you mount the hidden tide and travel back home, awash, letting yourself settle in. All the hemispheres in heaven are sitting around their fire chatting while stitching themselves together into the great circle inside of you. Our practice stitches us back to what we thought was broken, or you remember our wholeness, which was there from the very beginning. So I'll send these to you, of course. And I want to, I'm going to share my screen now. And I'll also, but before I do, I'm going to ask Cesca to come on. So it may take a moment for her to arrive. There she is. Welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah. I wanted to just be able to greet you and in front of everyone more personally, since not everyone knows you, maybe many people do. You know, when I ask people to join me in these talks each day, some of it was because there were 3 people for whom there would be ceremonies. Trudy, the end of her head student ceremony, Catherine's entering Josh's entrustment ceremony, which I mentioned that first day. But that's not the only reason I ask people. One of the reasons I did is because it's a way to enact this stitching together, to enact our relational quality of how we support each other as we blossom in our practice. And on this day, I thought, even though there wasn't a ceremony, there's a kind of a, if you'll allow this, Cesca, there is a ceremony in the monastery which is called leave taking. And it's a time when a monk is going to continue their practice. They're going to be in the world doing everything they've done before, but they step out of the monastery. And just like there's a ceremony of entering, there's a ceremony of leaving. And I know you're not going anywhere.
No, but it's completely appropriate. Thank you.
Yeah, but some ways you're just stepping a bit back and stepping into a powerful creative practice, which you're going to share with us. So I'll let you do that part. But I wanted to say this so people would understand this context. So should I go ahead and begin just a bit? And we'll both disappear. And I have a couple of images. Some of you know that I enjoy photography, and Cesca is my partner in crime here. She loves it as well. And it'll be clear as she describes her practice. And I have two images from the beginning, which are mine. So I'm going to go to that now. Okay, you see that okay? Lovely. On one of our retreats in the lakes, I took this image, and I was particularly taken by these two buds. I think they're agapanthus maybe. The way they lean on each other. There's a kind of an intimacy there that I particularly liked. And one day, as Cesca was keeping time and assisting us in walking meditation, I also took this image. Those are Cesca's hands. And I'll let her begin now. And I'll do my best to follow along and cue the images at the right time. And we'll see how it goes.
Okay, thank you so much. Flint, by the way, has been my photography mentor as well as my Zen teacher for quite a few years. I came to Zen through Hakomi. I was in the same training cohort as Josh and Judy and Catherine, and we were incredibly fortunate to have Flint as one of our trainers and Trudy as an assistant. The central foundational practice of Hakomi is something called loving presence. It's a practice of reversing our natural animal tendency to look for threat, to look for things that don't meet our expectation of how things ought to be, and to look instead for beauty and strength and wholeness. In short, to look with Buddha eyes at Buddha nature in everyone and everything. Recently, I read a review of a photo book in which the reviewer wrote, "Photography cannot generalize. It's always a specific moment, always the very right now, replete with details and nuance. And while photography certainly has its own universe of cliches and limited visions, its strength comes from specificity and exactness." My photography practice reminds me to look with fresh eyes and to see beauty everywhere. I've never been the most observant person in the world or even on my block, but I'm learning to slow down and look more closely at minute particulars, to marvel at the mystery of how the entirety of existence is reflected in every unique form, every gesture, every event. I'm constantly bowled over by the dearness of people. "14 years ago, I was in Kota Kinabalu with my son, and we were walking back to our hostel from the night market when we were set upon by a gang of children. They'd seen the camera in my hands, and all they wanted was for me to take their picture. Look at these guys. How can you not fall in love? They'll be grown up now, maybe with families of their own. I certainly hope so. I came across this young woman about 2 years ago on a Sunday morning walk in the park with her parents and grandparents. When I saw her, my jaw dropped. I said, "You look amazing. Can I take your picture?" And she posed with such dignity and self-possession. But what tickled me the most was her parents and grandparents standing off to the side, bursting with pride. Her dignity and confidence were no accident. Then there was this little moment of rapport with the kid being used by his sister as a living tripod. And this moment of pure joy at Brighton Pride. And this one, just around the corner from the last one, another flavor of humanity. Who are these people? What are their histories? What are their hopes, their dreams? What anguish do they carry? What love? Hakomi also inculcates an experimental attitude, which is another way of describing beginner's mind. What happens if? This picture is of my granddaughter, who is a dedicated practitioner of experimentation and discovery. The whole world is new to her, and she's on fire with a mission to learn about it. Here she's investigating the heft of her father's new shoes. And at the other end of my family line, this is my father, just a few months before he died. He's also on fire, raw and open to his last moments of seeing, hearing, feeling, and being, accepting everything, pushing nothing away. A few months earlier than this photo, when he was slipping in and out of a coma, he had a lucid moment. Finding me sitting next to his hospital bed, he said, "Who do I thank?" And I said, "What?" And he said, "Who do I thank for all this?" He meant life. He was a fourth-generation atheist and had no spiritual context. But faced with his own death, up close and personal, he had that moment of opening that saw him through. The world is so full of beauty and occasions for wonder, of order arising from chaos. As John Tarrant says, moment by moment, the imagination, dreams, and hopes of others press on us. By others, I mean people, animals, and even trees and rivers. These patterns in the sand of a beach in Devon were made by nothing more than wind and water. And so were these patterns on a cliff in Formentera. Light is something you could spend lifetimes studying. This is our dear friend Sophie with her cows. This is the shadows of trees stretched out on the cobbles of London's South Bank. And the shadows of trees dancing with the shadow of a fence on a path in Richmond Park. Light directs our attention. I find it fascinating how that happens. Although some photographers work in a studio manipulating the lighting, I prefer to work with natural light, which is unbiddable. You can only hope for it, wait for it, and adapt to it. And then there are the life forms, plants and animals, miracles of architecture, every one. I'm fortunate to live near 2 biodynamic farms where I can get to know the cows and the pigs. Eyelashes, the most amazing eyelashes, and that wrinkled brow. This beauty was also enchanted by the light. Well, this piglet was somehow left out of the rough and tumble games with her siblings. And these are pigtails. And then there are trees. Every nodule, every twist and turn, every bifurcation that you see here was the result of a unique combination of many factors. The tree's own DNA, light, water, soil, wind, temperature, insects, birds, parasites, humans. The structure of a tree is a large print version of the Book of Life, a lesson in how everything changes, everything is interconnected, everything is contained in everything else. For me, trees are the clearest illustration of how, as they process through their lifetime, all living things become more themselves, and yet not only themselves. A mature oak tree is an ecosystem that can include 400 different species. Our own bodies are the same. Only about 43% of the cells that make up our own bodies are human. And even those cells contain mitochondria, which have their own DNA and evolutionary history. This tree was lovingly tattooed by humans, but it has grown right into and out of the rock. Is the rock part of the tree? Is the tree part of the rock? Yes. Vines wrap around trees, which fall down or merely shed branches. Other vines and moss grow on that, and it all becomes a collaborative, sculptural, ongoing creation. And that's just on the surface. A woodland is like a superorganism, the trees all connected underground, exchanging information and even nutrients through a fungal network that I recently heard described as the wood wide web. It's one example of that lovely quote Flint brought yesterday from Aitken Roshi: the entire cosmos is a cooperative. The same is true of societies, neighborhoods, and nations. Friends arrive, bringing other friends with them. Viruses, fleas, other parasites, new foods, new styles, music, poetry, language, new ways of thinking. We are constantly revised by every contact, if only by molecules or moods. We're tempered, reconstructed, sculpted, refined, or roughened. Change happens to us from without, and change happens from within as we adapt to altered circumstances. Todo cambio, everything changes. One of my regular sources of inspiration, along with most other people in the Sangha, is the poetry of Mary Oliver. This one might sum up my practice. Mindful. Every day I see or hear something that more or less kills me with delight, that leaves me like a needle in the haystack of light. It is what I was born for, to look, to listen, to lose myself inside this soft world, to instruct myself over and over in joy and acclamation. Nor am I talking about the exceptional, the fearful, the dreadful, the very extravagant, but of the ordinary, the common, the very drab, the daily presentations. Oh, good scholar, I say to myself, how can you help but grow wise with such teachings as these? The untrimmable light of the world, the ocean's shine, the prayers that are made out of grass. I'm in a high-risk group for coronavirus, and so I started self-isolating even before the UK officially went into lockdown. I haven't left my house since March 13th, but I'm fortunate to have a tiny postage stamp-sized garden. I'm a lazy gardener, and I don't interfere much. And so over the years, it has become progressively more complex, diverse, and interconnected. My project during lockdown has been to photograph whatever blooms on any particular day, whether I planted it, like this tulip, or it's a persistent invasive weed, like this exquisite lesser celandine. I waited for 2 weeks for the first blossom to open on the clematis montana, watching the buds swell and deepen in color until one finally popped. I learned that the leaves of bracken ferns impatiently escape out the sides of the curled stems as they unfold. And I learned that this rhododendron, which has graced the garden for 30 years, has 4 white petals and 1 with a yellow stripe. And that lilac is many colors, not just one. That Solomon's seal has its own eccentric way of counting. And that white currant flowers are tiny, but intricately structured and very beautiful. I have a particular fascination for the way things age, their structure intensifying even as it disintegrates. These are the dying leaves of that white tulip. Perhaps my favorite of all of Mary Oliver's poems is one called Peonies. The ones she writes about are pink and white. My pink peony is barely in bud, but this red one bloomed just yesterday in time to show you. So I'd like to conclude with the last lines of Mary Oliver's poem, Peonies. Do you love this world? Do you cherish your humble and silky life? Do you adore the green grass with its terror beneath? Do you also hurry, half-dressed and barefoot, into the garden and softly and exclaiming of their dearness, fill your arms with the white and pink flowers, with their honeyed heaviness, their lush trembling, their eagerness to be wild and perfect for a moment before they are nothing forever.
Thank you so much, Cesca.
Thank you. Thank you.
Quite beautiful. I appreciate your effort in curating and putting together these things, and together we put together the sequence, and
it was perfect. It was seamless. Thank you.
that's kind of a marvel that I could be doing one part and you doing the other. Mm-hmm. But I particularly loved the those words that you were speaking about in the last bit. Do you love this world?
Mm.
I think in some ways that's where we have to remain as the ultimate inquiry question. Do you appreciate your life? Do you love this world? Not do you approve of it?
Yeah.
Not do you assent to everything as just what you would want by releasing what you want? Can you love this world as it is and cherish the humility and the beauty, understanding the beauty of the grass and I love the terror beneath, what that means. And do we rush forward, in other words, with some enthusiasm and wholeheartedness to embrace the world and fill our arms with each other and it? Wish we could hold each other again. And her very Mary Oliver statement about the wild and perfect for a moment before they're nothing forever. When we have done in the past our retreats here in Hawaii, in the center of the room which we sit, often when I'm teaching with Donna, it's a yurt-like structure, so it's round. And in the center, Aaron will place a kenzan, Japanese bronze holder of flowers, and he'll sometimes put 3, if we have them in the summer, usually 3 agapanthus, 1 a bud, 1 opening, 1 very open. So they make a nice, and then we leave them there. And those that are closed begin to open. Those that are open begin to fall apart, and we don't touch them. And that's what we're seeing each day, the ongoingness. At the end of the poem that was written for me when I was head student, similar to the one that Jan read to Trudy, Mai Benji was commenting on a moment. This is the final part of the poem, a moment when we were at the Kaisando, which is called the Founders Hall, where you offer incense and do bows in the morning to the founder of the temple. In this case, it was Suzuki Roshi, before we go down and open the zendo with people sitting. And so it was just the 2 of us quietly in the dark morning. And she pointed to the flowers in the vase on the altar because they were drooping and need to be replaced. And then she said, "But you told me they're just bowing." So thank you. We'll maybe move now, as we have in the last few days, to a time of inquiry. We'll do our final chant. Would that be okay? And may our intention equally permeate every being and place with the true merit of Buddha's way. Beings are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless. I vow to enter them. Buddha's way is unsurpassable. I vow to embody it. Beings are numberless. We vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. We vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless. We vow to enter them. Buddha's way is unsurpassable. We vow to embody it. Beings are numberless. This vow frees them all. Delusions are inexhaustible. This vow ends them all. Dharma gates are boundless. This vow enters them all. Buddha's way is unsurpassable. This vow embodies it. I look forward to seeing all of you tomorrow, and Josh and I will be together.
I look forward to that, Flint, and thank you and Cesca for a truly beautiful evening. I will take many of Cesca's images in my mind with me this evening If you're in Europe and the UK, we'll be opening the Zoom room at 7:20 tomorrow morning to be led by the Sussex Sangha. And we meet again tomorrow night at 7:20 for our final evening of our online retreat. So we look forward to seeing you then. Thank you so much.